This is the state of where we're at. And I guess the argument, and how I'm going to tie this back to backup and recovery, is we've had backup products, and I'll pick on them all equally, TSM, Veritas, Commvault. These products have been around for 20 years or more. They've been around in the era that moved from mainframe into physical client-server computing. But then making that same architecture with agents and, oh, look at that. With agents and proxies and media servers and all these things that you have to manage, you basically build another data center to back up your data center. Doing that, you know, is sort of like hanging on to the yesterday, right? It's hanging on to the problems of old. And I illustrate that, you know, if you look at all the innovation that's happening in the marketplace, a lot of it, you know, flash, automation, orchestration, private public cloud, none of that's been applied to the backup space. And so when Rubrik called me, I was like, backup's kind of, you know, no offense to the backup administrators in the room, but it's the backwaters of IT. Like, nobody wants that job. But a lot of it's because of the current state of backup and recovery, right? And these aren't my statistics. These are ones that I pulled publicly from not only companies, you know, analysts like Gartner and IDC, but even from Veeam and some of our competitors. Average cost of application downtime, somewhere between $100,000 and $700,000. You know, it takes the average time to restore for an enterprise is about 18.5 hours. Now help me understand why my mother, non-tech savvy, can drop an iPhone in the lake, go back to the Apple store and get 300 apps back to her phone like that, right? But yet we live in an enterprise world where it takes me 4 hours to put a database back into production, right? This is the pain and the realization that we're living with. And so as customers like yourselves, a number of folks raised their hand and said, hey, we're gonna go out and look at backup and data protection architectures. These are, according to TechTarget, the top 3 things folks are looking at when they make a decision around backup and data protection. Total cost of ownership being the highest. Everybody's cost conscious. We want to be able to scale linearly as our business demands. And we want to be able to hit our recovery time objectives, meaning not take 18.5 hours to put an application back into production when we have an issue, right? And I talk to Fortune 100s across my territory who are like 4 hours, 3 hours, 6 hours. And I'll tell you a little bit about how Rubrik does this. So our view, now we'll draw the analogy from the Electoral College 240 years ago. Technology is like 1 year to every 10 in the innovation space. So let's just go back 20 years, right? Not a lot has changed. We have backup servers, proxies in the network that we load balance and manage, configure firewalls to work with. We have databases that are built on SQL technologies that don't scale very well. We have to patch and upgrade those OSs that support those media servers. And then we archive to some kind of media. And then around 2004, we started to realize tape sucked, we couldn't meet our backup windows, and recovery was even worse, so we introduced this concept of disk targets, right? Data domain, deduplication, you know, NetApp, some of the storage vendors, VTLs. But architecturally, nothing really changed. We just created another management point in, again, this data center to back up your data center, right, in the picture that I've drawn here. So Rubrik's vision is, you know, what if we start with a clean sheet approach and we build a single software that eliminates proxies and media servers and all of those components that you have to manage, and we converge it onto commodity hardware that delivers global deduplication and compression. What you see here is our flagship product. It's called a brick. A brick is actually a self-contained cluster of 4 nodes, so it's a masterless scale-out architecture that then scales from 4 nodes to 8 nodes to 12 nodes to, I think, our largest cluster right now in production is 50 nodes, supporting about 10,000 hosts. We've got some very large enterprise customers because they're tired of, I'll go back to this slide, building the components, right? Think about some of the larger enterprises, and we're working with the state of Utah and Facebook and Citadel, which is a $25 billion hedge fund in Chicago. These guys had this challenge of managing hundreds of databases and multiple data domains that scale up but don't scale out. And it got just far too complex. And so we introduced this product that scales out, managed as a single system, the same way Amazon and Google and Facebook manage their infrastructure, and then give you the ability to age the data out to something cheap and deep. So it says public here. That could actually be private, could be S3, object storage, NAS, AWS, Azure, you name it, and we give you the ability to index it out. So at a very high level, this is Rubrik. We deliver a lower total cost of ownership as opposed to buying backup software and deduplicated storage separately. We are a scale-out architecture that goes in, and Mike, the SE here, I think in 1 week installed 6 POCs in 4 days in 3 cities. The brick goes in an hour. You uncover your vCenter environment. We start defining policies, and an hour later, you're backing up. It's literally that simple. And you compare that to, you know, our competitors and what it takes to deploy their architectures. So Just a quick high-level overview of what we do. How do we deliver on those things? Simplicity, I mentioned. We rack this box, we bootstrap it. The first thing we do, we give it vCenter credentials. We're VMware today and also physical Linux and bare metal SQL deployments today. In Q1 of next year, we'll do bare metal Windows as well as Oracle via RMAN. I'll get into those things in a second, but for the sake of just understanding the technology, it's API-driven. And so we're leveraging VADP and VMware APIs where they have them, where they expose them. And we begin taking backups once those policies are defined. The first full, incrementals, do I replicate, do I archive, all that gets defined in a policy called an SLA domain. So no more concept of jobs. No more daily jobs, weekly jobs, nightly jobs that you have to map back to a host. You create a policy and then assign VM objects at any level in the hierarchy of your vCenter to a policy. So that means a VM, an individual VM, could have a platinum level policy, and a folder or a cluster could have a turn the Wi-Fi off. Could have a its own policy, so that when a VM gets spun up inside of a folder, it will get auto protected via the policy that's been assigned to that folder. So you get that level of granularity. Then we begin taking backups. We do this in a parallel ingest, so it's very fast. It's web scale architecture. 4 nodes in a box. Each node connects to Ethernet top of rack switch. There is no master in the cluster, right? Each node is masterless. We can lose nodes. We can lose drives. There's a lot of resiliency built into the architecture, but from a performance perspective, we also use all those ingest lanes. So each brick does like 4 terabytes an hour. Add a second brick, you get 8 terabytes an hour. Add a third brick, you get 16 terabytes an hour. So the biggest enterprises in the world are saying, I have to back up 300 terabytes in the night, and I just can't do it because I got to buy 6 data domains, and I got to stand them all up and mask LUNs and zones and all these things, right? So in our world, it's just a math problem. How fast do you want it to go? It's all ingested into Flash. So the Pure guys were up here earlier talking about where Flash is going. We're using Flash technology in our box, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The biggest reason we use Flash, in my opinion, why do we back up? So we can recover, right? Backup is for novices, recovery is for the experts. Like that's when the ish hits the fan, right? And this is why it takes us 4 or 5 hours to deliver. So when we back up the VMs, we actually make those available to mount or live mount on Rubrik. A single Rubrik of device delivers about 25,000 I/O. You have 4 of them, you have 100,000 I/O in your backup environment. We have no rehydration penalty. So unlike other deduplication appliances or VTLs that maybe you guys have seen, the pain and why it takes 4 hours is I'll just walk you through. I have Edward Elmhurst, big hospital in Illinois. In fact, after the merger of Edward Hospitals and Elmhurst Hospitals, they're the largest hospital in the state of Illinois. Big net backup and data domain shop. Took them 4.5 hours to put their SQL database back into production. Okay, why did it take them that long? Well, I have to rehydrate the data out of data domain. Data domain's not very good at running real workloads, random I/O, and these kinds of things in the environment. So they've got to move that 4 terabyte database across the wire. That probably takes 3 of the 4 hours as they're moving it across the wire, and then bring it up on production storage in that environment, assuming production storage is available, because those things have problems sometimes too, right? In our world, I don't have to rehydrate anything. We're viewed as a storage mount point in vCenter, and you just live mount 1 or hundreds of those VMs right off Rubrik. We are built as a scale-out, version-aware file system, which means every point in time backup that I keep, I maintain, and I track the delta changes across multiple versions and copies. That means we protect you from ransomware. So a big use case for ours was customers that were getting hit with ransomware. They just roll back to the last copy or backup, and they live mount it, and then just storage vMotion the entire file system back up when they're ready. Edward Elmhurst, back to that story, they did a POC with us. 53 seconds it took, because we have vCenter credentials, to unhook the VNIC, deprecate the name of the production VM, live mount our 4 terabyte database in its place, and bring it up. And then they did it with 8 more, and they did them all in a minute. Right? We have a customer with Deltaware. I don't know if they're here today, but they were pretty happy. They bought Extreme IO. They were excited about all flash and the production array, and they found out there was this little. This isn't picking on EMC day, but they found out there was an issue where they had to do non-disruptive upgrade of their Extreme IO environment. Well, they live mounted 20 of their mission critical VMs off Rubrik, did their upgrade, storage vMotion them back. It was a use case they'd never even thought about. Right? So there's a lot of things that we deliver in this in terms of recoverability, and I don't even think that's the coolest part. The coolest part is, I said we can age data, so in the policy you define when you archive. So I could keep it on Rubrik for 10 or 30 days or 6 months, depending on what your retention variables are. and then have that to be able to live mount, instantaneously recover, or I can choose then after 30 days to archive it to something cheap and deep. But when we archive it, when we ingest the VM, the initial VM, we crack open the VM and index the entire file structure of the VM and maintain that file structure in this Google-like search. So now I can search for an individual file across the entire enterprise. This could be 1,000 VMs and 1 billion files. I can do a Google search for a single file and recover it, whether it lives here or in AWS or Azure. And what's unique about that is nobody else can do it in the sense that they have to, instantiate the VM to bring it back. We actually ship the metadata ahead of the data, which means we can ship it to the archive deduped and compressed, and this can become a smoking hole in the ground, and we still can instantiate what we call cloud instantiation, a Rubrik instance in EC2, and crawl your archive. And all of a sudden, this becomes cloud data management and gets pretty exciting, right? The economics of archive haven't been there for customers because the pain is, well, if I put 100 terabytes in the cloud, it's cheap to put it there and cheap to keep it there, but the minute I need one 2K file back, I got to pull the whole VM down. And that VM might be a 500 gig VM, right? Time, money, and bandwidth. Certainly money, because the egress is about 6 times as expensive from an AWS as it is to put the data there, typically the way they write those contracts, right? Questions on that? See some heads nodding. The question is, how do you handle data delay? Data.
We're pulling. Sorry. So we pull directly via the APIs from VMware, from VMware. We're actually, from a protection perspective, we use NBD SSL. So there is a secure socket layer that we're going to actually transport the data to our device. So that data does have a protection policy there. In the event that there's corruption of data itself, you would have to. We do have Active Directory integration, so they would actually have to have the ability to log into the device and delete the data itself. You can't log into our device and change the data sets. I can't go in and modify files. The only thing that you'll see, and this is on the primary side, is ransomware. We'll back up that data. If it's corrupt before it gets to us, or if it's encrypted before it gets to us, if they're hit with ransomware, we'll maintain the journal of all those encrypted files. So we're not going to protect for that. As far as the snapshots themselves, they're essentially immutable as well. So the first... Yeah. Okay. I'm not familiar with that. Yep. Okay. Yep. Yep. Okay. Yep. Yeah, from a security perspective, we do offer encrypted devices as well. So not only are we transporting that via NBD SSL, we do have data that's encrypted at rest on our appliances.
So the encryption is 256-bit AES. We actually have a FIPS 140-2 level 2 compliant box, and the DoD is actually placing these things all over the place. So that sales team is actually somebody I'd be happy to put you in touch with. I think that's a little bit over Mike and I's skis as far as some of the crypto conversation too. So definitely stop by the booth and we can put you in touch with somebody. But all I could tell you is I know we're doing a lot of business with like the Intel agencies, and we developed this 140-2 level 2 hardware platform for some of the most highly regulated industries. All right, any other questions on this slide? High level, makes sense, what we're doing? So the question is, do we run into limitations with VMware being the only way to get the backup? and specifically performance. Yep. So what we've heard is VM stun is a common scenario where with VMware snapshots, if you guys aren't familiar, it doesn't do a very good job of cleaning up after itself. And if you have workloads that are virtualized that have lots of I/O and change data, change block tracking sometimes will hang and the application will hang and it leads to performance issues. The combination of our architecture, which is parallel ingest, as we talked about, into Flash, and then RIP, which is we wrote our own volume shadow copy service for application consistent backups that also deletes and eliminates the snapshots at the ESX level and maintains all of that metadata on the Rubrik level. And so, you know, a great example I can give you is Red Hot Casino. They're a Pure Storage customer. Every time you pull the transaction on the database, or on the database, pull the handle on the slot machine, it dumps a transaction in the database. So they had issues with VM stun and they could not get their backup of their core SQL database. This is about a 4 terabyte SQL database. We went in on a Tuesday and they actually bought our product on a Friday. They've been a huge advocate for us since then, and because we address the performance issues. There are other mechanisms, so as I'll talk about in, I think, what's next, here you go. This is our 3.0 release. This is new for us. We have about 15 customers running early access program on it right now, and we will GA in November. So for everyone in this room, it's practically here. And this is where if you don't have an API that we can call, like VADP, then we have to run some kind of a lightweight server on the service on the OS to be able to grab the data application consistently. And so with Linux, we have a connector that gives you the ability to have file sets, so you can exclude MP3s or only grab email, PSTs, or whatever you want within a Linux environment. Next spring, we introduce bare metal for Windows with the same concept. We'll have a small service that'll run on there. And then bare metal SQL, we actually have a small connector that phones home and had granularity, like I said, at the hierarchy of the vCenter we can do with databases. So you have a database server running 8 DBs. You can choose to put 3 of them in gold, 2 of them in silver, and the other 3 into can you turn that off? Into scavenger class, if you will. Oh, I've got test databases or QA databases, and then they'll phone home and auto update. So it's not like you need an SDK kit. We don't use the term agents because it has such a bad negative connotation. We don't want you to be in the business of having to go update agents and roll patches and do that stuff. So it's a very lightweight service that we did on the SQL side, and then it also does host side deduplication and recognizes change block tracking on the database, so that we only send, similar to like a DD Boost technology, only send the change blocks from the SQL DBs back. And then in the spring of the year, we'll have Oracle as well, and then Oracle will be via RMAN. So that's kind of how we're broadening beyond just VADP. But with VMware, if they have an API that we can grab, you guys heard Stephen Foskett this morning, right? That's where everybody's going, is automation and orchestration. So what I'll talk about in a little bit here is that everything you see in Rubrik is API driven. So in fact, there's features that we don't have in our UI today, like Oracle, that already exist in our API that we publish. And so you can go and basically build workflow and automation around our API for the end-to-end backup and recovery use cases. So the most common example is with role-based access. I have the user role, where the user can go in, log into the portal via a browser, and basically just see the systems that through AD they have access to see and then recover from. We don't allow them to write policies. We don't allow them to back up more stuff. It's just a user role, so they can get to that recovery. And that's what I hear is a lot of the times from customers, like, I just want to get backup out of the hands of my IT infrastructure team and back to the end users where they can do their own thing. Yeah, the question is, does that allow the user to restore files they deleted on their own? Yes, it's exactly what it does.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yep. So you have that option. Chris has actually done some write-ups on how you can actually, move around the management kernel. I typically, to get 10 gig, I'm not going to back that up through the management kernel, but I can also manage the UI through that with really no impact. That's typically what we do, even in the larger shops. So, but yeah, you have options there.
Question is, are we doing a block level backup?
Essentially, You're doing fixed block dedupe. So yeah, we're pulling it in, via the APIs, but essentially, yeah, we're writing it down, in 64K blocks. When we go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So, correct. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to show you a demo. I mean, the question is how how do we solve for what a lot of the traditional block backups don't? But again, by using the APIs from VMware, we're able to pull the data itself. We're able to index within each individual VMDK. So we know they're coming in as a VMDK, and then our technology on the back end simply goes in, cracks open that VMDK, and crawls the entire VM and essentially journals every single file right down to however often that backup takes. So if I want to recover a file or a folder or an entire VM itself, then I'm simply able to, I have all three of those options. It's not just I have to spin up the entire VM and then pull the file out of there. So, and I'm happy to show you a demo after this, but good question.
So, like I said, kind of wrapping this up, another question.
Yeah, the question was how granular can you back up SQL? So you can set up SLA policies to back up the database itself every hour, and then you have the ability to back up or truncate the logs every minute and have an extended retention period on that. That's new with our 3.0 release. The question was, does Rubrik have any plans to compete on our roadmap with like a Recover Point or like a Zerto? We actually work with them as opposed to against them. So really the answer to that is, you've got your 10 mission critical apps. They do a great job. The guys that actually are the founders of Zerto wrote Recover Point and then just did it for the virtual world. So pick your 10, 20, 30 most mission critical apps or VMs, run Zerto with that, where you have a longer recovery time objective or recovery point objective. That's where we come in, and that's where we work with them. So.
I like to use the word continuous data protection. That's not us.
Correct.
We're not doing block level replication. Yeah.
We would just replace Avamar for the longer term in that scenario.
And give you more capabilities from a DR perspective, but again, it's not synchronous. It's asynchronous replication from a DR perspective, which we'll talk about. Yes. Yep. So we do replicate. I think there's a slide coming up that actually shows that. So obviously you guys have seen this. We want to reduce all that complexity, Rubrik, archive out. I'm just going to jump to the replication slide real quickly. But we, here we go. We do replicate, and again, it's deduplicated and compressed before it goes across the wire. So you don't have to rehydrate the data. It's very thin. And then the same way as I talked about earlier, now in this picture, you actually have 30,000 I/O in this brick over here, which is essentially a storage mount point in vCenter that you can live mount any one of these replicated copies. Typical SLAs will be about down to the hour. We can get down to 15 minutes. But essentially, it's just change block tracking. That's getting the backups over here, and then every time we take a new backup, we're just replicating over to the other side. And you can replicate bidirectionally as well, so you could have production at both sides replicating to each other.
The question was, is replication one-to-one or many-to-many? So it's many-to-one or one-to-one right now. We're not doing one-to-many at this time. But we did actually just have a release of our robo offering, and that was actually just announced either yesterday or today. So that's in the case of large retailers that have 3,000 stores. They have 10 VMs per shop. So that would be, hub spoke. I've got 3,000 VM or 3,000 virtual instances of Rubrik out there backing up, journaling, and it's sending everything back to the main location. So good question. Good questions.
All right, I'm going to fly back up here quick. So benefits, I said, easy to set up, right? No babysitting, no load balancing. Start small, grow as your business grows. You start with a 4U or a 4-node, 2U appliance. You add another brick, you're now an 8-node cluster, and you just grow. Lower total costs, like we said. We do TCOs with every one of our proposals. The idea is that comparing, 3 and 5 years out, you buying and maintaining your backup software in conjunction with some storage or disk target, we should be 30 to 50% lower cost. Okay, so by the way, APIs kind of bring that back. I mentioned you can use this for live storage. So a lot of our customers will say, hey, I've got this DBA that every day just wants a clean copy of the database for, something, analysts, whatever he's doing with it. Just live mount that right off of Rubrik and then blow that thing away. And we do all of that through our REST API, which we publish. So this is a screenshot of our Swagger utility. And, another example of that where you can actually go in here. If you're not a programmer, you're not a scripter, it can be intimidating to go out and learn, what VRO is or looking at PowerShell, some of these tools. We make it very easy. This is in our UI. You can do a get file and you can actually test it and you can build this into your workflows. So what's happened is the community has actually grabbed this and started to create packages with vRealize orchestration, with ServiceNow, that are freely available on GitHub. So we don't charge for any of this. It's sort of a community-driven effort using, again, our REST APIs. Compare and contrast that, guys, to the vendors I opened with that started 20, 30 years ago. Those are all CLI architectures. So when they talk about their API for next gen, it's a wrapper. And I promise you, you can only do about 60% of the actual system calls through the API, and everything else will end up driving you back to the CLI. In our world, I say 100% plus you'll be able to use, and that's because, like I said, before features even hit our UI, they're in our API. It's the opposite, right? And so we're building for that roadmap. So I think that's my my buzzer, my cue. I'll just close with the key architecture principles. Again, we're following the convergence strategy. Customers who've already thought about converged or hyper-converged infrastructure, you collapse compute, network, and storage, but yet you still have all this disparity in your backup architecture. Collapse that down to a single appliance, API first, driven with policies, not jobs, and enable that global search capability to make file recovery and instant recovery of your workloads a business benefit from this environment, right? So I mentioned we have some big customers. You guys can see the logos up there. And in every single vertical, from what it's worth, we've been shipping this product for 5 quarters. We've had the fastest growth of any enterprise startup company in the past 10 years. That includes Palo Alto Networks, Pure Storage, Nutanix, some big ones. So we're getting a lot of waves, and part of that is because why? The large enterprise can't scale their backup infrastructure today. And then we scale down to as small as 100 VMs. So if you fit somewhere in there, we might have a good story for you guys.